Hey guys, and welcome to Mastering Lighting Lesson 4. It feels really good to be able to say that again after all this time, but I'm not going to focus on any of the negative stuff that's happened over the past few months. I just want you to know that I've made a few massive changes in my life to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again. I'm at a new place, things are going really good, I've got my health back on track, there's no broken bones anymore, I'm heavily motivated. Hopefully you can see over the past few weeks all the live streams I've been doing and the content I've been getting prepared for lesson 5 is an indication of just how motivated I am. I feel like the biggest change I've made though is going to be working at Cream 3 days a week. It feels great to work with those guys, with Connor, Victor and Dimitri. They've got an amazing 3D team there that's producing work better than I ever was doing at the studio. So it's great to see such massive improvement. Dimitri's doing really good. He took my place after he finished the Mastering V-Ray course, so it's going to be good to get back in there and kind of see what he's up to. But at the end of the day, I'm in a really good headspace right now, and I feel like I've made these changes and they're big enough changes that nothing like this is going to happen again, bar me getting hit by a bus. But I'm not going to focus on any of that stuff. I'm just going to get stuck into the lessons. There's a lot of stuff to catch up on. There's heaps of content to put out. Hopefully you like where I'm going with things. I'm going to try and keep the lesson at or under 90 minutes from this point in time. Kind of failed with this lesson. I went a little bit longer than expected, but it's going to take me maybe a lesson or two to figure out the best way to compress that knowledge. I really hope you like the lesson. I put a huge amount of work into it. I can't tell you how many times I tried to record this, went back over it, and wasn't really happy with the direction. I feel like finally, after all this time, I've broken through, I've got my creativity back. I'm personally proud of the lesson, but at the same time, I know it's been a while, so if you've got any feedback, you can always email me. I've been staying on top of them, just another one of the things that's kind of an indication of my motivation levels at the moment. Sometimes it's very difficult when you're getting so many, but I have stayed on top of them. I'm really excited, and hopefully you enjoy this. Alright, see you guys. You won't always get a rough concept from art directors on projects, and 90% of the time when you do, there's a pretty good chance that they're going to be so basic that it's very difficult to understand what type of lighting or materials to use. So, in order to achieve the client's desired goal on a project, you have to first start thinking for yourself and communicate your ideas to your boss. Not only does this make you a more valuable employee, but also more reliable and trustworthy. There's no point going off on a tangent if the client has delivered specific requirements, so communication is the key. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that you have a client who is open-minded about how the project can evolve, and you have a bit of free rein. So you get a concept like the one I've drawn. Now, it's fairly simple. It gives you a decent idea about the color and camera angle, but it also raises a lot of questions, specifically about the way the material is going to look and how the lighting is going to be placed. But there is enough of an idea fleshed out here where I can start looking for references in order to model and bring the project to life. I strongly suggest for those that aren't working in a studio or you're your own boss to always flesh out a rough concept if one doesn't exist already. You don't need to be awesome at drawing, and as you can see with my own concept, it's pretty crap, but you do need to use your creativity and forward thinking to put something out there to make sure you're going at least in the right direction. You'll notice that as my project progressed, certain things were added or removed, but at the end of the day, the finished result still has the same general vibe as my initial sketch, which brings me to stage 2. Now, reference is your most important asset, and it's the primary reason why I work with 3 screens. You can simply never have enough reference on hand. Now, whether that's images taken from Google, photos you've shot yourself, or even physically having an object there in front of you. So go down to the store or outside and find something close to your source material so that you've got it there physically in front of you to refer to. If you don't have a professional camera, just use your camera phone. They're pretty much good enough these days. Just make sure that no matter what, you've got lots. Now also, these days clients are mostly aware that the more reference you give CGI artists, the better the end result's going to be. And they sometimes even give you detailed reference sheets to work with notes in order to meet their brand's requirement or the vision of the project itself. But if you aren't provided with this, or you're working on a project from home, I'd say it's absolutely essential to build your own. I do this on literally every single project. No matter what it is, no matter what I'm trying to light or shade or model, I've always got multiple references up that I've hand chosen that are going to help me get the detail across the line. You want to find examples of images that sit well with your concept. So jump on Google and start creating a high-res reference sheet or two if you've got multiple screens. And also, like I was saying earlier, feel free to make notes in order for you to piece the best parts of each reference image together. In order to save time, I'm not going to cover the modeling stage in very much detail, but I will quickly break down the process I used on the project. Firstly, you load your reference image or concept into the background of the 3ds Max viewport. Now I like to custom model things, so I started with a cylinder and then began extruding out the tendrils until it was relatively blocked out in terms of the basic topology. Just something really basic like this. Yeah, you get the borders. Select a few edges like so. And then you just start extruding and shaping those out. Now you can use the 2D pan and zoom mode. So if I wanted to say extrude out and follow along this shape, just do so in screen mode. Cap that off. And just do that for each tendril coming out. Eventually you end up with a model that's kind of blocked out, so I'll just unhide that. Now this has been smoothed once. I don't have the old, I think there was a bit of an error with the geometry, it was crashing max, so this is just the subdivided version of that. But then once you've got something like this, usually I'd take this into ZBrush and start refining and giving some of the tendrils a little bit more detail just to bring out that extra bit of realism. So inside of ZBrush you can see with the base mesh I've actually just extruded out the edges a lot further. So I've just grabbed this mesh, pulled it out, much wider, and then just connected all the points just to make sure that in ZBrush I've got enough detail there to sculpt it efficiently. And basically you can see down even in the center there, I'm hiding that because I haven't even finished the model properly. The topology is a little bit messy, but I have gone in using reference images the whole time, gone in and tried to make some of the detail that's going to catch some nice highlights. Now I did actually cheat a little bit on this job. Usually I might even go back and project this onto a low-res bit of geometry and re-topologize it so that the lumps and swirls in the model pick up much smoother highlights. And you'll notice that at the later stages of this lesson, when I get to the Photoshop side of things, I am going to need to paint out some of the problems that are a result of having a kind of messy bit of geometry. Now we do that all the time in the print industry. We never have enough time to really go in and polish absolutely everything, but we do our best to get most of it in there. So even if the retouchers do need to make adjustments to the reflections, you know, it's not a major pain in the ass to do so. If I go back into Photoshop, I'll just show you kind of where I got the idea from for having the swirl and the splash. You can see I've ended up with something very similar, but then I've utilized, you can see over here, you know, the general camera angle, the general kind of swirl and splash is very similar, but then I've taken shading and lighting references from other shots. So I'm kind of combining two different shots together. You know, I'm trying to combine the lighting from here and here with the general model setup that we've got here, as well as the lighting from here. Because obviously this to me didn't look as much like thick chocolate as it did more like, you know, caramel milk. Whereas these shots have a much more thick appearance to them. So keeping that in mind, I made some adjustments to the model in order to make sure that the end result wasn't going to look too thin and viscous like the milk we've got up on the top left here. You can see mine is just a little bit thicker, it's a bit more gooey. In order to achieve that, a great tool is to use the inflate brush. Obviously I'm just exaggerating there, but you can really push out the thickness in areas uniformly with that brush. So you've got your model set up. The next thing we're going to move on to is setting up the composition in the scene. Now, compositionally speaking, this is a fairly simple scene, so we don't have much room to play with, which in my opinion is a good thing. All we can really do is try and bring out the depth and the scale in the scene. There's no requirement for the rule of thirds or golden ratio here. We just want a simple, symmetrical, in-your-face shot of some chocolate splashing with enough room around the edges for the client to be able to crop in with or play by adding some copy to. For that reason, I'm not even going to worry about the camera settings too much on a scene like this. I'll just adjust in real time until I'm happy. Now, I actually probably only spent about 2 minutes to set up the camera. You know, not every job requires you to think outside the box and, you know, try and go extreme on camera angles or experiment with giving the client multiple options. I'm also going to stick with using the standard 1.333 aspect ratio. I use this 90% of the time because, like I said in the first lesson, it's the same as most high-spec cameras and gives you a bit more vertical space to play with. When I first started drawing out the concept image, I hadn't actually seen the reference image that you're looking at on the top left here. So as you'll notice in my concept, the camera angle's a lot higher because I was trying to base it off a scene a little bit more like this, where you could see into the splash. But after I saw this reference image, I really liked it. I thought this was a much better candidate, and therefore I based my camera angle off of a scene like this. So when positioning the camera, I was trying to hide the inside of the splash. So I can't go too high, but I don't want to go so low that we lose the depth in the splash itself. So I'm just going to bring in a standard max camera, just kind of drag it out from the front. And I'm just going to start playing with the positioning. You can see everything's pretty much default. There's just not much we can do, you know. I don't want to go to, because of the way the chocolate dips in, which adds to the way the reflections are going to be bouncing around in this scene. I can't go too low, and I'm just on the edge of going too high where we can see into the splash. So like I said, you know, there's really not much you can do, and I was pretty much happy with this. If I swapped the camera used in the final render, look how similar it is. You know, I didn't try and match that, I didn't try and copy that with any tricks. I literally just dragged the camera out and placed it in front of the scene. While we're on the topic of composition, I also wanted to introduce a sense of macro scale into the scene, as well as place more focus on the splash itself. Now, the easiest way to do this is by simply adding depth of field. I added as much as possible without blurring the hero splash itself. Very rarely you'll find a client that wants to hide their product from the user. At the bare minimum, if you're working with a product that has logos, they must always be the focal point. So I'm just going to go in. I've just got the occlusion pass set up in Octane here. I'm going to go into the camera tab, and if I drag up on the aperture, you'll notice that the depth of field starts to become more apparent. I played with a few different settings. I'll just let this clear up for a second with the setting of 3. I'm just going to use the autofocus picker and select somewhere in the middle of the splash, like here. The goal being to keep the back tendrils and the front tendrils relatively unblurred, or a very minor amount of blurring. So as you can see, instantly it helps put more focus on the splash, but now the front and back of the splash are just a little bit too blurred for my liking. So I'll drop that down to 2 and see how that looks. So once again, the blur is just a tiny bit too strong now for my liking. So I ended up, after checking out 3 and 2, just went down to 1 and eventually settled on that because the depth of field was very subtle, but we still got enough at the back there to blur the reflections and pull the focus in. And the final result is, now that it's all cleaned up, you can see that the front edge of the swirl and the back of the scene have enough depth of field, but the splash itself is relatively untouched. In order to demonstrate how I've set up the shaders in the scene, I've removed every single light except the key light to the left, and I'm just going to break down one by one how I've put together the different layers in the shader. In Octane, I always use the slate editor because it's a little bit unorthodox in how you have to build shaders. It's not like the V-Ray blend material where you can shove everything in and kind of visualize it at that base level. Here things get a little bit trickier, and in my opinion I think they need to make some changes in that regard, or at least implement a blend material like you've got in V-Ray, so you're not doing things like what I'm doing here. But I've got the beauty render going here. I'm just going to select all of the chocolate and just show you what each section of the shader looks like. So down at the base, it's just a simple Octane glossy material. Now you see this has no subsurface in it. It's just purely the equivalent of just a V-Ray material with reflectivity. And you lose, when you don't have the subsurface, you lose the realism at high res that's essential for rendering chocolate. It gives the chocolate character, you know, it adds light in areas that you wouldn't usually get it. So in order to achieve the subsurface effect, I've blended 3 different materials. There's the base glossy material, which is going to give us all of the reflections and a lot of the diffuse color. So now you'll see that in the diffuse color, I've got a mixed texture plugged in. And then if we go up and up here, you'll eventually see that there's just a whole bunch of maps kind of linked together. What this is doing is, and I do this on everything now to introduce a bit more realism, is it's blending a red, green and blue noise map together additively in order to create a colored noise throughout the diffuse texture. So let me just go in here. I've got the glossy material applied. If I go in and assign just the mixed texture here to the diffuse, and we start rendering, if I zoom in here, take a look at the noise we've got happening in the scene, and I'll just let this clear up a little bit more. As you can see, it's quite strong at the moment, so in order to properly blend this through the diffuse map, I've applied it to a mixed texture, and in the color you can see in the color correction node, I've got mixing the two together. I'm just blending the noise you're seeing here with the brown color you're seeing here, and I'm only adding the noise through at 10%. So now if I go and apply that mix texture back to the diffuse and we zoom in, it's very subtle, but if you don't have it, you definitely notice it. So let me just let this render now. Hopefully you can see, I know the quality drops a little bit when recording the lessons, but hopefully you can see there's some very subtle noise kind of filtered through the diffuse map here. I know it's subtle, but these are the type of things that I keep saying, you know, when you accumulate enough detail, then you end up with the realism. Now inside of Octane, you've got two different ways to add the scattering in each material. Inside of the specular material and inside of the diffuse material. Now each has its different looks. So if I apply the specular material to the chocolate here and let this render, I'll just show you how this comes out. So if I zoom in here on the edge of the tendrils, you can see using the specular version of Octane's subsurface scattering, we get the nice light leaking through the thinner areas of the mesh and giving it that red tinge that helps to distinguish chocolate from, say, plastic. So now if I go into the reference image, you can see this is what I'm trying to replicate. And even though the coloring is a little bit off, I thought something was a little bit weird about this anyway. I've seen some reference images that are a bit more red and some that are a bit more orange. I think it just depends on the type of chocolate, but either way, that's what's giving me that red base to the shader. Now I can't just use that by itself. So the next thing I've set up is the subsurface in the diffuse version. So I've just got a diffuse Octane shader here. I've set the color to be brown. And inside of the scattering, Octane scattering works with you have to think of it as the opposite colors. So when you're absorbing more blue, the green and red channels are left. So the more blue you absorb, the more green and red are going to be left. The more red you absorb, the more green and blue are going to be left. So you've got to kind of invert the colors a bit there. But there's nothing crazy going on. It's just a couple of settings to set up and the scale, and just adjust the scale. You know, you'll let more light through. So I'll just, as you can see now, using the diffuse version, it's not as obvious, but now we're getting light coming through in a completely different way. We're still getting the red tinge, but essentially they look completely different. So now if I've gone in here, you can see I've made a mixed material of these two. There's no map blending them, except I've blended more of the red shader and less of the diffuse shader. So there's only 10% of that diffuse shader coming through. And I'm just guesstimating here when I look at the chocolate. You know, there's no scientific basis for this. But as you can see, by blending the two, let me just go into the mixed material here. If I blend through at, say, 0.3, now more of the diffuse versions coming through. So if you want to use these shaders on your own projects, and say you've got something that's a little bit more solid and cold, then you'd mix in more of the diffuse version of the subsurface. But because I've got a very hot, splashy liquid version, I only wanted to implement a small amount. You know, the same thing for the specular version. Inside of the roughness, I'm just using a fall off map, and that's why you get these very blurry reflections on the edge. But also remember that on top of those two subsurface materials, I'm blending over the glossy reflective non-subsurface version, so it's kind of overriding the reflections in those areas up to a point. So now if I apply the final shader over everything, you'll see we still get a very subtle amount of the reflection coming through, but most of this shader is built up of the solid glossy material here, and it's in the front on areas where we're getting more of the subsurface coming through, just how it would in real life. Because chocolate is such a commonly photographed subject, it's extremely easy to find awesome reference images to base your lighting off of. Now, I don't think this is a subject where you necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, but you will need to understand the order in which we're going to be adding lights to prevent overlighting your scene. So before I add any lights, what I like to do is look at the reference sheet and try and determine what areas from different images I like the best and how I'm going to incorporate them into the lighting of my scene. Now, my hero lighting reference I've got is this one here. Now you can see this scene is lit by a single spotlight and it's producing a really nice result. Because it's such a small light source and such a shiny and intense light source, everything's pinging off really nice. The material's reacting awesome. You can see that GGX type reflection happening. We've got the subsurface coming through on the thin areas. The leaves are getting blown out and filled with a bit of green and color. And we're also having enough light being put in where the camera's pinging off some glints, which always help in CGI to add a bit more realism. Now, with that being said, we've got a very similar image here, but this is lit slightly differently. This is lit instead with softboxes, which I'm not going to necessarily be using for my key light, but I am going to be incorporating a couple of lights like this to enhance the reflections on the object itself. You can see here that, when you mix that red, green, and brown color together, it kind of unifies everything. It's really aesthetically pleasing and it just looks tasty. They're just colors that go well together. I'm also going to be trying to incorporate some elements of the lighting in this scene in terms of the directionality we're getting from left to right, and how, because I know I've modeled from a scene like this, how it's going to be bringing out some of the subsurface in the thin areas. But really my hero reference is this one. So all I need to do is simplify the whole process by using a single light to try and capture the look and feel we've got in this image and then modify things from that point. The most important light is always going to be the key light. It's usually the strongest light source in the scene, and its primary purpose is to bring out shape and dimension on your subject material. That doesn't necessarily mean the reflections. For me personally, having a nice key light is there to bring out the shape no matter what, whether that's the diffuse or the reflections. But when you're dealing with a scene like Chocolate, the highlights here aren't as aesthetically pleasing as they could be, but the overall diffuse and shadows really help to pull you into the image. So how do you know where to position a light source like this? Well, the easiest way is just to simply move the light around, because we've got real-time feedback, and adjust based on how it's reacting to the surface. So the first thing I tried was to go quite low in the scene, and I'll just pull that off camera. And you can see we're getting some nice lighting on the edges here. It's pulling out some of the highlights and it's bringing it back off the background. But the problem with having the light source so low here is that we're losing all the detail on the inside of the splash. My goal is to bring out the entire image, not just one part. Even though I'm trying to make the scene look a little bit darker, making it look a bit sexy and moody, I don't want to go too dark where you're losing detail on the surface itself. But if you ever see a light source look good in a location and you think it might be good later on to add as a bonus pass, just keep a mental note, duplicate the light and disable it and label it in a way which later on you're going to be able to go back and figure out whether or not you want to use it. So also I tried moving the light source behind the image a bit more, but you can see here immediately we're putting way too much focus on the back edges of the object. We're losing a lot of shape. And remember, this is the key light. This is meant to try and shape the whole job. So you don't want to go in and put it in a location which is hiding areas of the mesh. I also tried having a little bit forward, and now you can see once again we're losing the shape. It's not casting shadows nicely across the surface. We've lost all of the subsurface effect on the object, and this probably looks the worst out of them. So you start using that as a guide. You start trying to figure out where you want things to go. You can see once again, having it directly side on, the shadows just don't look very nice. We know we need to go a little bit further back, just enough so that the highlights and the inside of the object are picking up some of the shape. Don't worry too much about the main specular highlight that this light source is creating, because we're going to go in later and add additional lights which fix that up. And if there's anything that doesn't look nice, we can always adjust it in post work. So I ended up settling on putting my key light slightly behind the surface, about the same height as the top of the pour. That way we're catching the highlights on the top edges of the strawberries and the hazelnuts. We're getting a nice highlight, kind of evenly, distributed across the whole mesh. I'm not particularly happy with how the highlights are reacting on the whirlpool, but like I said, we can go in later and fix those up. Now moving on, the next issue I've noticed is, even though we've got a key light in the scene, it's not picking up highlights on the left-hand side everywhere I'd like it to. And we're also losing a lot of detail in the front edge of the surface. You can see here it's just completely in shadow. So I'll let this render go for a little bit longer, and then I'll explain what I've done next to try and make up for what this key light is lacking. Technically speaking, the next light I added into the scene would be called a fill light, but I'm going to go ahead and call it a secondary key light because it's going to be put in a very similar position. It's going to be shaped differently, but the goal here is to kind of combine the two main lights in the scene so that you can't distinguish that there's two separate light sources lighting this left-hand side of the image. The main key light I've got here is working really well, but the front, as you can see, it's just a bit dark. So I'll just let it autosave. I'm just going to go in and unhide the secondary key light I've put into the scene and let things render again. Now, even though there's a brand new light in here, it's very hard to tell that there's actually two different light sources because they are positioned so close to each other. But now we're doubling up on the shadows, and the front edge here is being filled a little bit, but like I said, I'm not really going to call it a fill light. We are going to put other fill lights in the scene that's purpose is to push light in, but this one was more just to mask the fact that the main light just wasn't wrapping around the surface enough. Now, in terms of the intensity of a light like this, it's much softer. This spotlight here had a value of about 6,000, whereas this one here has a value of about 1,000. If I go too high on this light, there's just too much light being pumped in underneath, and we can start to see the fact that there actually is still that main key light in the scene. So I've balanced this out and dropped it down enough so that it's kind of blending together with the background light enough that you can't tell that there is two light sources. I might even stick with 1500 just because it's pumping a little bit more light in there. So I'm going to let this render. You can see now that just with two simple lights, we're 90% of the way there in terms of how the image actually looks. I don't want to detract too much from this. So I've got to be careful with the intensities and the locations of where I put the future light sources. So at this point, I'm pretty happy with how things look. It's very rare that I get an image to this point only using one or two lights in the scene, obviously bar using an HDRI, which is a lot more complicated, but only using a singular point light and a very small softbox, things are looking pretty good. And I know now that from this point on, I've got a very good chance of making an image that's going to look pretty impressive. It can be a little bit tricky sometimes when at this early stage the material or the lighting just isn't working at all, and you have to sit there and go into the shader and start making adjustments back and forth. Whereas on this project I actually didn't have to do that. I just had an idea of how I wanted the chocolate shader to behave using a single light based on the reference we've got here. I modified the shader until it looked good with that singular light, and then from that point it was pretty easy sailing. One of the critiques I got when over the last few months where I've been inactive was that the course wasn't really following a technical path, and it's very difficult for me. I mean, I'm doing my best to include that information in there, but I'm self-taught. I never learn fundamentals about light. What I learned was how to look at an image objectively and try to figure out the best way to enhance it. That's what I'm trying to get across to you guys on the course, to stop and really take a serious look at the image, up close, far away. Every time you set a render off, you should be making little adjustments in your head, little notes about what can be fixed or changed. So there's only two lights in the scene at the moment, but there is information that we could bring out here on the right hand side. So the next thing I wanted to do after looking at this image was try and figure out the best way to do that. Now the first thing I tried was simply duplicating the key light we've got over here, and I'll just bring that over. I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller. And I'm just going to hide the two left lights, just so I know exactly what effect this side light is having. And I'm just going to move it around and play with it until I think it's in a good location. I'm going to drop the intensity. I'm going to play with the size of the light. The cool thing about Octane is that even if you increase the size of the light, it doesn't increase the intensity, so you can get away with not having to recalibrate the power. V-Ray doesn't really work like that. It's based on a size, so as you increase the size of the light, it's pushing more light into the scene. I don't know, it's just user preference, but I personally find it a little bit easier in Octane, even if it's not physical, just from a creative standpoint to make adjustments. So I wasn't really happy with having a large light in here, and I had to make the light larger in order to soften the shadows that were being cast from it. So what I did is I deleted that light, and then I swapped to using the light source in the secondary key light and just duplicated the plain light. So you can see this light is very subtle, but now because it's a rectangular softbox, we're hitting a little bit more highlights on the right hand side, but this is a very subtle light. It was just to bring out the shape in the right hand side of the hazelnuts and the strawberries, but there's still not enough light on the edges of the chocolate, so that is something I made a mental note of to decide to do in HDR Light Studio. So now I'm going to unhide my key light and my secondary key light. And I'm just going to let this render again. It's great in Octane to take a look at the quick result, but I'll always leave it hanging just for a couple of minutes to make sure that it is doing what you'd expect. Because sometimes when you're dealing with a complicated scene with multiple subsurface materials, it does take a little while for the highlights to clear up, and you don't want to assume that the light is too dark here and then have them overblown out when you wait 30 minutes for the render. So I'll just let it hang for a little bit longer to see the effect this is having. So hopefully you can see as the scene clicked over there what I was talking about. Now that the render's been going for a couple of minutes, if you look at the way the strawberries are filled and in terms of the subsurface, they're much brighter. Now if you scroll back a little bit in the video and just kind of scroll back and forwards, you'll get exactly what I mean. So even though that light is very subtle, it's not introducing any ugly reflections into the scene, it still is having a profound effect on the way the strawberries and the hazelnuts look. There was actually one other Octane light I put into the scene, and that was a fill light on the front, just because I was a little bit unhappy with how dark it was under there. I wanted to at least bring out even just a very subtle amount of shape. It can still be dark and shadowy, I just didn't want it to come out black. And as you can see in the shadows here, there's just no light getting through. So I duplicated the main key light and dropped the intensity down. And it doesn't really matter where this goes, just as long as you're not too far behind the camera. You can see where it's positioned. It's just roughly, from the camera's point of view, in line with the main key light. But now having that light on, it's only got 500 in the power, so it's even half as effective as the side fill light. You when you get all these three lights together, going from highest intensity to middle to lowest, you kind of wrap the light around the scene a bit. And now you see in these dark areas, we're no longer getting pure black. And once this clears up a little bit more, we will see a little bit more reflection and highlighted, areas coming through there. So once again, I'll let this clear up just so you can see what I'm talking about with how when you leave it a little bit longer and you let the deeper, subdivisions resolve, you end up with a slightly different looking image. As you can see now on the front edge, we're getting really nice gradation from light to dark. There's no longer a kind of sharp cutoff from light to dark running along this front face. It's really nice and smooth now. The only places that don't have light are on the very far right hand side. Now I'll probably fix that up with HDR Light Studio, but there were a couple of other plain lights I used in the scene just to bring out some detail in areas that I didn't think were catching enough highlights. For example, on the back edges of the spirals and the front of the scene, as well as the side of the pore. So even though we're getting really nice gradation across the surface, it's going to require a very specifically placed light to catch a strong highlight there. In order to do that, I didn't want to just rely on a simple Octane light like you see here that looks a little bit simple. I got away with it, but most of the time I'd rely on a textured light source to bring a little bit more detail in. But for something that needs to look clean and pretty, I thought I'd minimize the use of something like that. But in order to create a light source, what I did is I opened HDR Light Studio. Let me just open that up. I disabled the background gradient, loaded up a simple spherical light and changed the size just so it would better fill the viewport canvas. And then simply adjusted the opacity ramp just like I would with a light source like you've seen me use in, the V-Ray lesson with Iron Man. So I'm going to change the gradation here. I always like to have a sharp little spotlight in the center and then have it fade off to help with the pings on the surface. And then I just rendered this out. So once that was rendered out, I loaded it into Photoshop as an EXR and cropped into it. And as you can see, I end up with just a simple texture with a nice clean gradient that I can use inside of Octane. Now it's fairly high intensity, so I'm just going to unhide that light. And you can see that when added, it just gives a little bit of a specular highlight on the left edge of the pore, bringing some of that detail out. So in order to better demonstrate that, I'm going to hide all the other light sources. And now you can see what this object's doing. It's less there for diffuse light and more there for the specular highlights that it creates across the left edge, especially on the strawberries and the pore. I'll just let this clear up a little bit for you so you can see how it's affecting the scene. And next up, I'll show you the additional light I added, which was based on the same principle, but situated behind the scene to bring out some of the highlights on the front edge. So now these two extra lights, they aren't really contributing much diffuse light, but they are pinging off some really nice highlights that give us a bit more definition in different areas of the scene. So now if I unhide everything, you can see the combined total effect of all the lights in HDR Light Studio, inside of Octane. Now, all of these lights end up making up 95% of the overall look and feel of the object. So if you think you need HDR Light Studio to complete the project, I hope I haven't misled you there. You still can definitely get away with only using in-render light sources. Now, if you use the V-Ray scene I've provided as well, feel free to, instead of using the reflector cards, just duplicate the V-Ray light and assign the texture I've provided to the light source, because I did get very similar results in V-Ray also. So HDR Light Studio isn't completely necessary, but I'm going to show you how essential it is for the print process because of how tailored you can make some additional reflections. So I'm just going to let this clear up and show you how it looks, and then I'll go in and make one more kind of final lunge towards the finish line by making note of all the final things I want to add and include on the surface. Like I said, we're 95% of the way there. There's just a few additional things that need to be added to really make the image pop and pull it off the background. So as you'll notice, I've got a new highlight on the front left here, but it's not as strong as I'd like. We don't have any lighting on the back side of the pore, which I think is really going to add a lot of, energy to the scene. The background and the silhouette of the splash itself is blending in because we've got very similar colors. So always, if you are trying to photograph this in real life, you just have to make do with that. The reason is, and this is the beauty of CGI, you wouldn't be able to physically put a light near that surface just to catch highlights. Whereas in CGI, you've got so many more options available. So I want you to, moving forward with this course, specifically this lesson, but all future lessons, as I'm progressing, ask yourself, what would you do to improve the image? I want you to have a crack at lighting a scene like this, whether it's this splash, I don't care. Like, go ahead, try and recreate the lighting, but just think of it objectively. Instead of technically, look at the image and analyze it and ask yourself what can be added here to help improve it. So in order to export the scene to Octane, I've just grabbed everything, including the camera. Make sure you do, or it won't load incorrectly. And I'm just going to export this to my projects directory as a default FBX file. So I've got Octane loaded up. All the lights in the scene are hidden, so that's why we're rendering with absolutely nothing. But now I've got the environment hook turned on. You can see I've got the connection loaded. And in the environment tab, I've got that loaded also. So inside of HDR Light Studio, I'll just go in and show you how all the extra lights out of HDR Light Studio contribute to the scene, and you'll get a feel for, kind of how simple it actually is, or how little it actually adds to the scene. There's just a couple of small things. This is all it's really doing. I've got a small reflector on the side here, just casting some reflections on the inside edge. I've got another highlight pinging off on the inside of the swirl. I've got a couple of small little hot spots pinging off in different locations, but the main reason, and probably the only light that really matters, if I disable all these other lights, it's this middle light I've got here, which is bringing out some detail on the inside of the splash. So now I'll just unhide everything in this scene, and you can see if I disable that, we lose the detail going on the inside. There's actually a small bug in Octane, I think, where it doesn't show correctly the lighting in the scene. So if you encounter that, maybe I need to upgrade my HDR Light Studio, but you can see I don't have any lights enabled in HDR Light Studio, and it starts wigging out a little bit. But adding that light on the inside, I'll just increase the intensity of it. You can see it gives the inside of the pour just a bit of shape and dimension. As I let this clear up, it'll become brighter and brighter. All the other lights, I don't even feel like I need to really, go in and explain. They're just there just to create little pings and stuff. They don't do much. It's just a matter of, finding little locations on the surface just to bring out some detail. I could probably do this 50 different ways and it would still, look acceptable on the image. But I'm in HDR Light Studio, but I still don't have all of the rim lights or anything like that. So I'm going to break that up into a separate section, render this off high res so you can see how this comes out, and then we'll move on to the next stage, which is the bonus lighting and the post-production. So the render's finally done. I ended up leaving it go for about 5 hours, just up until the point where the noise was cleared enough that I could go into Photoshop and remove the rest manually with its own noise reduction tools. But I also had a slight issue. The real-time adjustment stopped working. Usually you can adjust the glare and the bloom in real time and kind of see how those different response curves are having an effect, but that stopped working. I probably just need to restart Max and Octane, but I didn't want to lose the 5 hours of render time. So I ended up utilizing the Agfa Futura 200 CD response curve out of Octane. And I'm just going to click the port to max frame buffer. You can see it looks slightly different. But I'm just going to save this out as an EXR, even though it's been flattened. It just produces, when you do save out as an EXR, it produces a slightly more contrasty version of the render. You could probably do it in Photoshop. Feel free to save the render off as a 32-bit TIFF if you'd like. Then you'll get the exact same result. But I'm also going to save off a version without the tone mapping, and it's going to be set to linear. Not that it really makes much of a difference after you turn off the tone mapping. So I'm going to hit the port to max frame buffer, Now you can see we've got a 32-bit version, which I'm going to be able to adjust the highlights on if needed. I actually didn't end up using this, but it's a good workflow to kind of stick to in case on some jobs you actually do need to rely on that full floating point image. I'm also going to turn off the post-processing and just go back and save out a version without the glare enabled, and I'm going to generate a glare pass by calculating the difference between the two. So I'm going to save this off. So now we've got 3 renders to save out of Max. One that has glare, one that doesn't. You can see up the top here we've got the 2, and the linear version. And I'm just going to bring these into Photoshop and start making some notes on how I can continue on the project to give it the final touches that will kind of alter it from looking a little bit basic to really giving it the final pop and attention to detail that it deserves. So I'm back inside of Photoshop now. I've got the 2 versions on the right here loaded up that have the glare with and without, and then on the left we've got the linear version of the render, which you can see has kept the dynamic range. Now on that render I'm just going to assign an exposure adjustment and set a 2.2 gamma adjustment. Now this is I've been talking about the use of the film response curves quite extensively lately, and in the next mastering lighting lesson I'm going to cover how there's a new workflow that I utilize to match the same type of look that you get out of Octane inside of V-Ray. Now when you don't have any tone mapping enabled, this is kind of what V-Ray looks like. You can see it has a very CGI quality to it, but when you do apply the color response curve, it can really help add a lot of depth to the image. Call it Instagramming if you want, but for me personally I found it really useful to rely on that, and I have worked with that on different jobs now inside of V-Ray. So I'm using Octane less and less, and if V-Ray had real-time subsurface, I wouldn't have even done the job in Octane at all, because like I said, I am starting to come around to the additions that V-Ray RT is adding. I'm going to convert this to an 8-bit file because, as you can see, we don't have any linear mapping anyway. The only reason I saved it out as an EXR was to get that extra crunch. If I go back into Octane, maybe you can see the difference here. You see it's just a bit more contrasty. But like I said, I'm going to make this 8-bit. I'm not going to merge the two, and the very first thing I'll do is just start separating the glare. So I'm going to set the mode to difference here, and I'm just going to copy that newly generated pass. Now you can see I've got the version at the base here, which doesn't have any noise. But if I paste this over the top and set this to screen, now I'm adding the image and I get a very similar result. I can probably even set this to linear dodge, and now I've got the exact same result, except it's on a separate pass. Now I've got the option to go in, set a curve on that new glare pass, and you can see I can bring up the glare in different areas. So I want to go in and make some notes now about what I'm going to do from this point forward. Just going to kind of look around the image, try and pinpoint some areas that I think can do with some improvement. Probably the first thing that I'm really disliking about the image is the massive highlight we're getting here. I want to improve that. I want to try and bring the highlights down in a spiraling direction if possible. So I'm going to have to do that in HDR Light Studio. Basically what I'll do is I'll paint this reflection out of the render, just manually paint that out, and then screen over the top a new highlight pass which looks a bit cleaner. So that's something I'm going to have to do in HDR Light Studio. The other thing I want to do is I want to bring out the splash off the background itself. You can see we're getting two colors here that are very similar on the back edge, and it's making it very difficult to distinguish the splash coming off from the background itself. So I'm going to try and work and put a highlight pass in around the back edge. And I'm also going to try and bring a little bit more of a highlight in to the right hand side here. You can see it's a little bit dark. There's not really much information on the splash itself, but this will be a less extreme highlight. So I'm just going to make a new color here just so that I know it's a separate light that I'm going to be adding in. And I'm going to be working with trying to get something happening up on the top edge of this highlight here. And probably flow just a little bit further around. The other thing I might want to do is, once again, I'm just going to make a new colored light here, is you can see the highlights. If I go full high res here, you can see these highlights don't look as good as they could. There's a lot of little details missing here. Sorry, not missing, but they're not blending together evenly. We've got secondary highlights underneath, and even though these things were all attributing to the way the chocolate itself was being lit up, as a result, we've got way too many reflections in the scene, and I just want to try and simplify that. So on the back edge of the chocolate, there's a nice highlight. On the side, we've got a bit more of a subtle highlight, and on the front here, once again, we've just got some nice even highlights in the peaks and the troughs of the splash itself. I do like the reflection we've got going in the back there, but I might need to paint that out. If I turn off these adjustments, you can see that it's kind of conflicting with the front. So I'm not sure if I need to go in and mask the back. So I'm definitely going to try and paint in a little bit of darkness behind the splash itself, just to pull that off the front of the image. So I'm going to need a mask around the side. I'll just paint that in white. Sorry. You can see my great handwriting there. I'm also going to create a mask for the inside of the splash. Sorry, the inside of the pour. And what I'm going to do with that is, I'll just make a new layer here. I'm going to try and bring out some of the detail in the splash that we're not really getting here. So I'm going to try and get a highlight flowing along the inside edge. I'm going to try and get a bit more of a slick highlight to bring out that subsurface effect on the back. And I'm going to try and bring off the edge here. So it's basically going to be, maybe I can get away with doing this in one light, but I might have to have two different lights, one a little bit more from behind and another a bit more in front, just catching this front edge. One of the problems I had was with rendering a piece of geometry like this is that the background, because the geometry dips in like it did, if I extended the geometry too far up, what was happening was I was losing the reflections that were visible on some parts of the mesh, simply because if you imagine from side on, let me just make a new layer. You can imagine from side on, you've got the bowl and then the splash is coming up here. I needed lights to go from behind, and if the geometry was too high, that it was simply blocking things from being able to hit the back edge. So in order to fix that, I'm going to make a new version of the model by simply grabbing just the splash area and simply around the front, and I'm just going to cut that off the background so that I can go into HDR Light Studio and happily create the highlights on the back edge of the splash itself. That's also going to allow me, once I do have a mask for the strawberries and the pour, to go in. I'm going to manually paint in and fill in this background. I don't know if you guys have seen my Cocoa Pops job I did, but I used the exact same technique for that. I just simply went in, got a color, and started manually painting it in. Because there's no detail up the back there, you can get away with it. So I'll just use a Wacom pen, and you'll see me just slowly, once I get to that point, I'll just blur it, have a couple of layers making up that, and then I'll kind of paint it out where it's not needed. What that's going to do is it's just going to fill the back edge of the image up, and it's going to allow me to later on go in and properly vignette around the whole image. Just before I go in and start cutting the geometry apart so I can create alphas of certain things, I'm just going to render off an ambient occlusion pass so I can add that to the stack for the post-production. and I'm just going to adjust that here. I'm actually using an older version of Octane because one of the newer versions kind of broke the functionality with the materials, and I wasn't able to get the same image out of Octane itself. So I'm sticking with an older version of Octane. If you want to use, and you've got a licensed version, it's version 1.9, I think. So in the different passes tab, I'm just going to go into the ambient occlusion, and I'll start the recording up when this is done, and I'll save this out and bring it into Photoshop. I'm going to use this pass to help bring out some of the shape in the strawberries that was lost because the subsurface is so strong and the lighting was, quite prominent. It was hitting through the whole mesh. So you can see on the splash we've got really nice contrast, but then in the strawberries we're losing that a bit. I'm back inside Photoshop. I've just loaded up the occlusion pass. Now it's probably a good idea to start naming the layers in your files, and as we start adding a little bit more detail in post, I'll start grouping some things together just to try and keep the layer stack organized. Now, if you've seen the live streams, you'll know that, that's not really my style. There was some pretty weird naming conventions going on there for a bit, but on a professional job, I always do try and keep the naming convention somewhat organized.